Hi, class. Welcome to lesson 3. This one will be the one where I talk about reform movements of the antebellum period. And in this lecture, I'm really going to be reaching into the past and into the future. I'll be reaching into the past because I'll be referring back to this idea of the common man, or by past I mean previous material. But I'm also going to talk about how this impacts the future of our country, especially when one of the reform movements becomes especially a source of sectionalism, that being the issue of the abolition of slavery. So I will begin this lecture by kind of reviewing the origin of reform movements of the antebellum period. I will talk then about specific reforms. I'll talk about 6. I will talk about some of the social reforms, or not social reforms, but social developments in the relationship between men and women. I will be talking about the beginning of the women's rights movement. And the 6th and final issue I'll bring up will be the abolitionist movement. And I will say very little about that in this lecture because I'll expand upon it a lot in the next and final lecture of this unit, lesson 4. Okay, so let's do a little bit of review from the previous 2 lessons and see how they come together. So remember that we are in the era of the common man. So during the era of the common man, remember that more common people have a greater say in society in terms of law, or in terms of elections. They get to elect people like Andrew Jackson, who they feel represent their will. So why does this happen? Well, starting in the 1820s, you see the common man get the right to vote, or at least the common white man, with the beginning of universal white male suffrage. And what happens when common white men can vote? Well, they vote for what they see, or who they see as one of their own. They vote for Andrew Jackson, who was considered to be a common man. Now, by the time he becomes president, he's a decorated war hero and he's very wealthy, but he did have common man origins, and he did kind of maintain a more common man lifestyle. There was a lot of spitting of tobacco that occurred in the White House whenever he was president, for example. Uh, and of course, as a result of the rise of the common man and universal white male suffrage, you saw candidates start to campaign more to appeal to common people. Andrew Jackson was very good at this. You saw this again with the Tippecanoe and Tyler II campaign, which also had another part of its campaign known as the Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign. But the overall effect of these political developments that I talked about in the first lecture about Andrew Jackson's presidency is that the common man gained more influence in government. So you didn't have to be wealthy to have influence. Still had to be white, still had to be male. We're about to talk about how some people have issues with this not being the era of the common woman. We're going to start seeing some people having issues with this not being an era that welcomes non-whites. More on that later on. But for the time being, remember that during this time period, this is a time of the so-called common man. That's the big political development of this time period. Now I'll move to the big religious movement of the time period, and that will be the Second Great Awakening. So here in the picture you see another one of those camp meetings occurring, very religious camp and emotional camp meetings. And remember that in the Second Great Awakening, Americans had, before this time, become less religious. Enlightenment ideas like deism had emphasized science and religion. They had de-emphasized, they had emphasized science and reason. They had de-emphasized religion. In fact, Thomas Paine, the writer of Common Sense, which draws from Enlightenment ideology, had later on written a very anti-religion book called The Age of Reason, and he basically said that churches were just there to control people's minds and take their money. So that's the cause of the Second Great Awakening, is a decline in religious values in the nation. And then probably around the 1820s, you have the Second Great Awakening, which pretty much happens at exactly the same time as the rise of the common man. And the effect of the Second Great Awakening is that people look to themselves for salvation and not to traditional church authorities. So in a sense, this is a common man religion. Now, If you look at your notes at this point, you'll see that you can kind of, if you look where you're writing this bullet about the common people, if you look to the left, you'll see that and slightly down, you'll see another reference to the common man or the common people. This is the rise of the common man in religion. So in the same way that the Jacksonian period represented the rise of the common man in politics, the Second Great Awakening, because it emphasized personal salvation through yourself, it represents a common man rise in religion. And what ends up happening is that as a result of the Second Great Awakening, a lot of people become religiously enthusiastic for the first time in their lives, or maybe for the first real time in their lives, and then they suddenly say, let's fix all the sins that are in society. Let's fix all the things that God doesn't like in society. And in the end, they especially will target slavery, and as you know, that will spark the abolitionist movement. This will really give rise to anti-slavery feelings, and it will create more sectionalism between the North and West versus the South. Now, I will say that abolitionism starts off small and it grows over time and gets big by the 1850s. More on that later on in this course. So let's combine these two movements. Let's combine the era of the common man, which is a political movement. Let's combine the Second Great Awakening, which is a religious movement, and see how they add together to create a time period of reform. So the combined effect of these two developments, political and religious, will be that the country experiences a time period of reform. So remember, again, that the era of the common man gives people more power in government. The Second Great Awakening gives people more power in religion. And what happens is you put these two together. The common man is going to say, let me use my newfound power in government to create or to elect politicians to pass laws that reflect my newfound religious feelings. So as people are getting more religious, they start to express their religious values at the ballot box. And one common theme here is that whenever it comes to these reforms, it's not going to come usually through violence. That doesn't get much done. It's going to come through government actions. So what people are going to say is, let's use the government. The common man is going to say, let me use my voting to influence the government to create laws that fix sins in American society. Now, women couldn't vote, but what women could do is they could influence men that would then go on to vote. And a lot of women were very personally affected by the Second Great Awakening. And again, I've told you that kind of stereotypically women are seen as the moral centers of society. Whether or not that's fair, that tends to happen. And so women will be a driving force in these reform movements. Even if they couldn't vote, they could go try to influence lawmakers. They could influence husbands and fathers and brothers and sons to vote. So they'll have their influence too. However, women really do want the right to vote as well. They want this to be the era of the common human, not just the common man. So what issues do they target? They will target the issues related to the mentally ill, which will become issue number 1 here shortly. They'll want to tackle the issue of prison conditions, which will be issue number 2. They'll want to tackle the issue of education or the lack thereof, issue number 3. They'll want to tackle the issue of alcohol abuse, issue number 4. And then I'll pause for a moment and I'll talk about the separating roles of men and women and how women feel like there should be a reform that gives them more government power. They want the right to vote. That'll be issue number 5. And then I will finish up this lecture by introducing the abolitionist movement, issue number 6. Now, of all of these issues, the anti-slavery issue, the abolitionist issue will become ultimately the biggest of the antebellum period. By the end of the antebellum period, the southern states are willing to secede from the United States, largely because they think the anti-slavery crowd in the North has hijacked the federal government to be anti-slavery across the nation. So remember, issue number 5, which I'll come to later on, will be about women pushing for equal rights, and in particular, though not only this right, but in particular, they're going to be pushing for the right to vote. They're going to be pushing for suffrage. So I'll talk about 6 major reform issues. The big kind of common denominator among all of them is that people think they should use their newfound power in government, especially the common man, to enforce reforms in society. In multiple times in American history, you have seen times of reform, and usually these reform periods happen when the government takes action, creates laws to make reforms happen. For example, slavery doesn't go away until you have the 13th Amendment added to the Constitution. Women don't eventually get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment is passed. So, in the end, oftentimes it's government intervention that creates positive change in society. And by the way, if you want to motivate the government to create these positive changes, you need to do so through nonviolent protest, oftentimes civil disobedience, which I mentioned before, will be the means to get these changes made. Okay, so in the middle circle of this chart, put antebellum reform movements. Again, put antebellum reform movements. If you write anything else, you won't be getting it right. So again, the common theme of this first chart is antebellum reform movements. And I'll go through them one at a time. So issue number 1 will be the issue of mental hospitals, mental institutions. Well, the fact of the matter was there weren't very many during this time. What ended up happening oftentimes is with mental institutions, there weren't many. So what did the government do with people that were mentally ill? They stuck them in prisons. And Dorothea Dix will be a major reformer. Notice she's a woman, so she can't vote, but she can influence people that do. And she will do that. So Dorothea Dix is going to go and basically look at how the mentally ill are being treated. And she's going to see that in the prisons, the mentally ill are being treated as if they are prisoners. And if you treat a mentally ill person like they are a prisoner, you just lock them up in a jail cell, they're going to get worse, not better. In fact, during this time, a lot of people looked at the mentally ill as maybe being immoral or demon-possessed, and Dorothea Dix is going to do a lot to try to change those perceptions of the mentally ill. And so what she's going to do is she's going to go from state to state. She goes to northern states. She goes to North Carolina. She goes to other states. I think Massachusetts, she gets a lot of work done as well. But she's going to go throughout the country. And she is going to basically report what she sees, and she's going to report some pretty nasty stuff. She's going to report on people that that needed mental help, that ended up going into a prison instead. She doesn't blame the prisons. She blames the government that puts these mentally ill people in the prisons. And in the end, she takes her reports, which again are sometimes just terrible. I mean, people that have degenerated to the point where they're ripping their own skin off and eating it and doing crazy things because of these poor conditions. And she's going to get states, she's going to go before state legislatures, read her reports, and motivate them to create mental hospitals separate from prisons to give the mentally ill the medical help they needed. And so she will do a lot, not through voting, but through motivating people that could vote and motivating legislatures. She's going to do a lot to help out the treatment of the mentally ill. On to issue number 2, prisons in general. So prison conditions were pretty rough back then. At this time, there was this such thing as debtor's prison, where if you couldn't pay back a debt, and sometimes this could be a very tiny debt, you and sometimes your entire family could be thrown in what was known as debtor's prison, which you see here. You could be put in jail for not being able to pay back a debt. And the picture kind of gives you this feeling of insanity, this feeling of disorder, this feeling of suffering, and that's what happened in the prison. So whether you went to jail because you were in debt or whether you went to jail because you committed a crime, either way the prison conditions were very bad. And basically it's not going to be good for your rehabilitation. Now, remember that one of the purposes of prisons is not just to punish people, it's also to help rehabilitate them to where when they re enter society, they can be functioning members of society. If you don't rehabilitate them, then they're much more likely to just commit another crime and go right back to prison. So I don't have a particular reformer to talk about here, but in general, reformers at this time are going to start to push for a change in the attitudes towards prisons. Now, remember that the common man can vote. And if the common man can vote, the common man's going to vote for the politician that keeps the common man out of debtor's prison. So you do see during this time period an abolition or an abolishment or an end to debtor's prison. So today you can't be put in jail for being in debt. There are other problems with being in debt, like ruining your credit score or having to declare bankruptcy, but there is no such thing as debtor's prison, and that's partly because the common man could vote, and the common man voted for politicians that got rid of debtor's prisons that tended to hurt the common man. More broadly speaking, though, prisons in general, they don't focus on just throwing someone in a murky jail cell for 10 years where they basically rot and mentally become less stable because they knew that once they were freed, these people were likely to commit crimes again. So prisons, while simultaneously focusing on punishing people and keeping dangerous people out of the general society, they are also going to focus on rehabilitation. If you look at prisons today, they do offer counseling, they do offer classes, and what the purpose of this is to help these prisoners, once they've served their time, re-enter society improved and less likely to go back to jail again. So prisons become focused not just on punishment, but also on rehabilitation, and debtor's prison goes away altogether. The next reform is going to be education, and that's going to be public education. Now, you know that there was a degree of public education in the northern part of the country that had dated back to the Puritan days, where towns were required to provide education to towns that had more than 50 families, but that was not widespread throughout the country, definitely not in the South. In the South, if you wanted to be educated, you had to have rich parents willing to pay for private tutors. So education up until the beginning of the antebellum period is pretty much limited to the wealthy. And this really gave the wealthy an advantage over the less wealthy in society, because the more educated you were, the more likely you were to have a better job, a higher paying job, the more likely you were to maintain power and influence over people that were less educated. There's this old phrase, knowledge is power, and there is truth to that. So a certain reformer is going to come along and he's going to say that if our country is going to survive, everyone needs to be educated. If you are educated, it creates a more equal playing field. For example, I grew up in a single wide trailer. I grew up without a whole lot of money in my home, but we valued education, and so I did well in school. And if my parents had had to buy a private tutor for me, I would not be educated, and I would probably not be eligible for very many jobs. However, with public education, it doesn't matter if you're rich or you're poor. Everyone has an equal opportunity to be educated, and therefore everyone has an equal opportunity, if you will, to obtain the so-called American dream, or at least the ability to achieve some sort of financial success. So again, there is more equality in this nation if everyone has an equal chance to be equally educated. On top of that, let me go to this specific point that the country only survives if the citizens are educated. People like Thomas Jefferson, people like Benjamin Franklin, when they created the Constitution, Jefferson was not there at the creation of the Constitution, but he was still a founding father. Franklin was there at the creation of the Constitution. The founding fathers overall believed that the country would only survive if the people that were voting were educated. If the people that vote are uneducated, if they are ignorant, then they can be easily manipulated by politicians, and they can vote for very bad politicians that could lead our nation down the drain. And so a lot of people said that our nation's success is vitally tied to being educated. So education, public education for all, was valued not just because it equals the playing field for people regardless of their background financially, it also is essential to the survival of our nation. If our country is a republic, has a republic government, and the people that are elected represent the people, then the people need to be educated so that they can vote for educated representatives that run our government properly. And if we are not educated, we will vote for people that are bad for our country, representatives and congressmen and women and presidents, etc., that could run our country into the ground. So, for multiple reasons, I'm harping on this point. There's this idea that the country will only survive if the people are educated. So, who is the big reformer associated with this? It's a man named Horace Mann. And Horace Mann is going to say that schools need to be available to the entire public. That's going to be expensive. How are we going to pay for this? Well, he's going to say taxes need to pay for this. And in fact, if you look at the budgets of many states in this country, a big part of the budget, if not the biggest part of a state budget, is the public schools, which again then can provide education to people regardless of their backgrounds and can create a more educated country overall that ideally can elect better leaders. Another thing that Horace Mann is going to promote is the idea that not only are schools available and funded with taxes to everybody, but everyone should be required to go to school, at least to a certain grade. Now, this level has changed over the years. I know that my grandmother, one of my grandmothers, was only educated up through 8th grade. At the time of the making of this lecture, you're required to go to school till age 16. I have heard of states discussing making the required attendance all the way up to age 18. But again, the idea is that we need an educated public to create equality in this nation and for our nation to vote for good leaders. And Horace Mann was the big pusher for this during the antebellum period. The final of the reform movements that I'll mention on the front side of this lecture will be the issue of not alcohol itself, but alcohol abuse. And a lot of people said that if we get rid of alcohol abuse, and some people say get rid of it altogether, but if at least getting rid of the abuse of it would solve a lot of society's problems. For example, you see in the picture here a man who is physically abusing the members of his family, and if you look at the caption here, it says the bottle. So in the end, the liquor bottle is being blamed for this man's actions. People were not showing up to work, or they were showing up to work drunk, or you saw people that were dying of diseases related to alcohol. They had alcoholism, the addiction. They had liver disease as a result. So a lot of people said we need to reduce alcohol use, and you'll have what's known as the beginning of the temperance movement. And temperance really meant moderation of alcohol use. Now, in American history, too, you'll see that the temperance movement is going to be a little bit more aggressive, and eventually they will get a law passed that creates the prohibition of alcohol, and you'll see a period where alcohol throughout the country becomes virtually illegal. And then you'll see how that ends up not being a very good law, but that's something for American 2. In American 1, you already see the roots of prohibition of alcohol. You see the temperance movement. And in the antebellum period, you will see an entire reform organization form known as the American Temperance Society. And they aren't going to be that successful during this time. Most of the social issue or reform issues during this time are ultimately going to be overshadowed by the abolitionist issue, the slavery issue, which becomes the issue of the antebellum period by the end of the period. One thing to keep in mind is that women were a big part of the temperance movement. Why? Because women were very oftentimes the victims of abusive alcoholic fathers or husbands. And remember that during this time, the men were the main money makers for the family. More on that in a moment. And if the man was drinking to where they couldn't stay employed, or they were coming home and spending all their money on alcohol, or they were coming home and abusing their wives or their daughters while drunk, you can see why women will be big leaders in this temperance movement. They can't vote, but they can influence people that do vote. If you look at this chart here, I'll go through it real quickly, but it kind of shows it's a very anti-alcohol cartoon that shows the so-called drunkard's progress. So you see here people drinking a glass just with a friend, and a glass just to keep warm, then a glass too much, then getting drunk on a regular basis, and then all of a sudden now they are alcoholics. And then from there things go downhill. They lose their jobs and fall into poverty and disease. In the end, they run off all of their friends. In the end, they turn to crime. And it gets pretty morbid here, but there is an association of alcoholism and suicide. And in the end, who suffers in the middle of all this? The rest of the family. Okay, on to the backside of this lecture. Let's talk about the women's rights movement. And it does connect to industrialization. It does connect to the rise of the common man. More on that in a moment. So what are the roots? Well, first let's look at industrialization. The roles of men and women are going to become more divided as a result of the first industrial revolution. Remember that before the industrial revolution, men and women did have roles, but these roles were not quite as separated. They were not as rigid, I would argue, before the Industrial Revolution, but they become much more divided and rigid once industrialization takes place. And so men and women are going to have what are known as separate spheres. And I'll talk about these two spheres, or these two roles, and then I'll talk about how that leads to the women's rights movement and the role of women in reform. So during industrialization, what becomes the role of the man? Well, first off, before the industrialization, the man might be manufacturing, the man might be working and building things, especially in the North, but they did so around the house, maybe in a blacksmith shop. Well, after the factories come along and run all the small town businesses out of business, you're going to see men leaving the home much more to work in factories. So the role of the man becomes much more outside of the home, which of course creates division between the man and the wife, which creates family tension. And when it came to politics, remember that this is the era of the common man, not the common woman, so it's considered a lot more appropriate for men to be involved in politics. They were the only ones that could vote during this time. Women had the right to vote in no states before the Civil War, during the Antebellum period. You did see some women get involved in politics more indirectly, like Dorothea Dix or the people that were involved in the temperance movement. But overall, women weren't voting, and they were not as involved in politics, and men were basically supposed to have a role outside of the home. And women are going to end up challenging this. But men were going to be active in politics, they're going to be active in reform movements, although I've already given you some exceptions to that, for example, Dorothea Dix. But again, it was considered more proper for men to be active outside the home because that was their role. What was the role of the woman? The role of the woman was to be in the home. And the role of the woman was to take care of the home, to take care of the family, to take care of children, to raise the children properly. So again, there's this notion of women being the moral centers of society, and one of the ways that they are the moral centers of society is that they are the ones that raise the children to have good moral character. They were not supposed to be active outside of the home. And some women are okay with this role. They said, the men have their sphere, we have our sphere. Just because we have different roles in society doesn't make one role more important than the other. In fact, keep in mind that if a woman raises a son, that son's going to grow up to be able to vote. And if the woman has spent more time with the son because the man has been working in the factories, again, we're largely talking about in the North, the son is going to reflect the woman's views more, and the son may well vote more according to how their mother had taught them. So in a sense, women got to vote through their sons. Now, again, that's the argument in favor of these separate spheres that some people accepted. A lot of women did not accept this role and did not accept it as equal. And they said that if this is going to be the era of the common man, this era should also include women as well. especially because if we're trying to reform things and make things reflect these new Christian values of the Second Great Awakening, well, women should lead that charge, they would say, because we are considered the moral centers of society. So we should push for these moral reforms. So in the end, women again are going to see society sometimes as an extension of their home duties. They're going to say that if alcohol abuse is bad for my children, then I should be caring about alcohol abuse for society in general. If the treatment of the mentally ill is something that I should be worried about when it comes to my kids, I should worry about that for society as a whole. If I should be educating my children, then the children of others across the nation should be educated. So in a lot of ways, women are going to say we should be taking charge of reform movements because they do reflect the needs of people in the home. And if you look at this picture here, in this one in particular, you see that women are the ones that are very much influenced by the Second Great Awakening. In fact, more women than men were impacted by the Second Great Awakening and were, if you will, woken up by the Second Great Awakening. Now, when women tried to get involved in some of these reform movements, especially the abolitionist movement, they got pretty upset because they already knew that they couldn't vote, and then they get involved in some of these reform movements, and then in the reform movements, the leaders of a lot of these reform movements end up being the men, and they tell the women to go do something else to help out, but the men are going to lead this. So eventually, there will be some women that resist this notion. They resist this idea of feeling like they're in a secondary role, and they're going to say that we need to have this era include the common women. So women, like men during the era of the common man, are going to want to have more power in government and society, and they're going to start pushing for the right to vote too. They're going to say if you can drop the property requirement, how about you drop the sex requirement as well? And some will also say, how about dropping the racial component? So they're going to say, let's keep this era of the common man going and let even more people have the ability to vote. So that leads me to issue number 5. And that will be the issue of women's rights. And this is a big deal. So make sure you know about the Seneca Falls Convention that I'm about to mention. Okay, so this also happens in the burned over district, by the way, which I talked about, and it's in Western New York. I talked about that in the last lecture. Let's talk about women's rights. So there will be a major event that happens in 1848, towards the end of the Jacksonian period, as we start to transition into another period that's sometimes known as the era of expansion. But again, this does relate to the era of the common man because basically women are going to say, we want to vote too. So in 1848, you're going to have a major event known as the Seneca Falls Convention. Star and highlight this one. Make sure you know this one. There's going to be a meeting in the small town of Seneca Falls, New York, and women and men are going to join, and ex-slaves. You may have heard of Frederick Douglass, ex-slave. He even attends this meeting. And at this meeting, at this convention, you will see women start pushing for the right to a lot of things, the right to own property, the right to have equal access to education with men, but especially the right to vote. And you're basically going to see a declaration not the Declaration of Independence, although it's very similar. It's going to be called the Declaration of Sentiments, and sentiments basically means feelings. So we're going to declare our feelings. We're going to declare how we feel about something. And the person that's going to deliver this declaration is going to be named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. More on her in a second. But what this declaration does is it basically takes the Declaration of Independence, and any time the Declaration of Independence says the word men, they add in and women. For example, the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, and in the Declaration of Sentiments, you see the phrase all men and women are created equal. If you remember in the Declaration of Independence, there was this idea that rights had been violated, and that the King George III, had violated the natural rights of the colonists. And in the Declaration of Sentiments, you will see the same thing happen, and you'll see this idea that men have been violating the natural rights of women. And so instead of calling out King George III, the Declaration of Sentiments is going to call out men for denying natural rights to women. And of all of these rights that Elizabeth Cady Stanton speaks of, the right that is most controversial and probably most important would be the right to vote. So whenever Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a major women's rights advocate, whenever she reads the Declaration of Sentiments, among many things, she calls out men for denying women the right to vote. And that makes perfect sense. Because remember that there was this idea in the Revolution, the American Revolution, of no taxation without representation. There was this idea that people should be able to govern themselves. And then when the Declaration of Independence comes along, Abigail Adams writes to her husband John Adams, hey, what about women? Why don't we get to vote? Why don't we get represented? Why don't we get a voice in local government? And Abigail Adams kind of starts that notion. Elizabeth Cady Stanton does it more formally with her speech, her declaration known as the Declaration of Sentiments. Now, just remember that suffrage means the right to vote, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the Declaration of Sentiments is going to demand, among many rights for women, the right to vote. And that happens at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. So everything that's in this slide, you need to know. Make sure you know it. And again, men did attend this meeting as well. This was not a meeting promoting men over or women over men. It was promoting equality. And ex-slaves attended this meeting. And that made sense because ex-slaves had basically been ruled over by white men the way a lot of wives and women felt. So what ends up happening out of this meeting? Well, first off, you need to know that this is the beginning of the organized women's rights movement. This is the moment in 1848 in Seneca Falls when the women's rights movement starts to get organized. However, its impact will be limited at the time because basically another issue becomes a bigger issue. So the women's rights movement starts, but then kind of gets put on the back burner or gets overshadowed by the largest of the reform movements of the antebellum period, and that will be the abolitionist movement. And when I say abolitionism, I'm speaking specifically about the abolition of slavery. Abolition means basically to abolish, to get rid of. So the women's rights movement is going to continue throughout the Civil War and after the Civil War, but basically even many women are going to agree that as bad as the inequality of the sexes is, slavery is worse, and so women decide to a lot of them decide to pause on pushing for women's suffrage and women's rights and say, let's put our energies behind ending slavery. And so that brings us to the last major issue of reform during the antebellum period, and that will be abolitionism. In particular, the abolition of slavery. Now, let me go ahead and say that this movement becomes the biggest movement of the antebellum period. However, it will not initially be a major movement. It kind of starts small and then grows over time. The Second Great Awakening is going to give strength to the abolitionist movement. And then whenever slavery starts to expand westward in the later later antebellum period, like the 1840s, 1850s, you'll see abolitionism become much more of a common thing in the northern states. And by the time of the election of Abraham Lincoln, abolitionism will be the biggest reform movement, and it'll also be the biggest or the most divisive reform movement. And this will be the issue, the reform issue, that the South feels most threatened by. And whenever Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860, a lot of southern states feel like he is going to cause the abolition of slavery in the South, even though he initially promises not to do that. More on that later on. But again, remember that the issue of the abolition of slavery becomes the biggest and the most divisive issue. It is the biggest driver of sectionalism, especially after the Second Great Awakening makes people see slavery as a sin against God, and especially whenever the United States acquires territory west of the Louisiana Territory, and there is no good compromise to settle the issue of slavery in the West. So I would say the two biggest things that cause, and I'm repeating myself, but for emphasis, the two biggest things that causes abolitionism to rise in popularity in the northern states would be the Second Great Awakening, making it be seen as a sin, and the fact that the country expands further west, and the North and the South fight over whether or not slavery can expand westward as well. So, in the end, this is the main issue that causes the American Civil War. It causes southern states to secede from the Union, and then it causes Lincoln to start the war in an effort to preserve the Union.